Henry, thanks for joining us today on Salad's Innovators for AI podcast. Excited to learn a little bit more about your expertise in AI security, what you guys are building at Fabrik. And so tell me a little bit about you, what you're working on, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Appreciate you having me. For sure. So I'm a chief product officer and co-founder at Fabrik. Essentially it's a company designed to solve some of the challenges that we're seeing across the B2B trust ecosystem. Specifically with a focus on the challenge that the kind of onset of AI has created between organizations who are both adopting AI and organizations who are sharing AI solutions as part of their digital supply chain. So happy to get into more of that detail and share more about the challenge that we're seeing folks that space today.
Yeah, man. Nice. Tell us a little bit more about you, like why security, why Fabrik, like what kind of led you to, being involved in this AI space and security.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spent more than a dozen years in technical program and product management, mainly in really regulated high security, high scale environments. So before Fabrik, I was working at Spotify, leading the launch and go to market for Backstage, which is an open source developer experience platform. So really intimate with developer workflows and also a lot of the challenges that developers have with meeting security and compliance obligations requirements as part of the build and deploy in a healthy product development process. And prior to Spotify, I was working with Clear, where I was building a lot of the security engineering compliance enhancements in support of the IPO and support of a variety of high intensity audits with Homeland Security, for example, maintaining physical hardware in an airport. There's a lot of kind of scrutiny that comes with that. So they're also kind of seeing that theme again and again come up around how do you build a security and compliance and governance function that is a partner to your product and business org and not a blocker. And equip your R&D org with the right tools and the right kind of frame of mind and the right sort of runways to help them build scalable, secure, and compliant stuff in line with their expectations. So all of those themes together kind of led me to this notion of, with the onset of AI across the digital supply chain and more companies racing to use this, we're seeing a lot of excitement around the business opportunity that it presents, but also not as much consideration for the risk, the guardrails, and the transparency that's needed to effectively govern and demonstrate compliance and demonstrate, secure practices and responsible AI practices with all this new technology. So seeing those themes is kind of where we leaned in with Fabrik and what we're building.
Interesting. So we hear a lot about responsible AI and kind of like this ethereal or mission oriented, like let's keep the world safe from AI. And then there's like all enterprises, let's say the Fortune 5000 that have compliance, regulation, security requirements. They have to keep their customer data safe. There's some laws involved in that. Like unpack compliance, right? As it relates to like real business cases, like practically, hey, we would either need to make money or we're going to lose money if we aren't compliant. So talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. It's an age-old problem. Security is not compliance, right? That's kind of like what a lot of practitioners say. And that's true for a reason, is that fundamentally compliance is a risk function. Right. So, any healthy, thriving enterprise needs to effectively manage risk. They need to anticipate all of the ways in which things can go sideways. They need to get ahead of that. And typically information security risk is obviously a big concern. A variety of breaches and vulnerabilities that are going to come up through the development process. You need to get ahead of those and manage those effectively. What happens is, kind of historically, the trends that happen are the risks of different types of attacks and threats come to the forefront the practitioners and kind of in the area of focus, and those risks need to be mitigated and addressed. So different frameworks are developed that kind of identify the common attack pattern of threats that could create novel risk. What happens over time is those risks are more and more frequently seen. Regulation steps in, and regulatory compliance introduces a whole nother level or threshold of kind of what it means to be compliant with something. So you have these sort of industry-led frameworks that define sort of the best practices, and then regulators typically step in and provide either an augmentation or kind of like an underscore on compliance to those established frameworks. So what does that mean in terms of like your business and why you need to do this? Well, number one is you decide to be compliant with things so that you don't get popped. Even though security does not equal compliance with industry, best practices and frameworks will give you a healthy baseline of security. It just can't be the only thing you do and think that you're done. And then beyond that, typically there is a level of trust and assurance that comes with certain compliance. And that is squarely a challenge that is something that organizations struggle with today, which is how do I demonstrate that I'm not just doing the bare minimum, but I'm actually doing something that is meaningful to my security posture, protect my customer data so that you can trust me if you're buying from me? And how do I demonstrate that trust and assurance as part of the procurement cycle? So when folks talk a lot about we need to get compliance or SOC 2 or something like that so they can close the deal, that's what they mean. Is SOC 2 is a proxy for trust. It says, hey, I've done at least a certain threshold of implementation of certain controls and governance so that you can trust, customer, if you buy from me, that I've done XYZ things that give me a baseline security posture that, I'm not going to screw around with their data or someone's not going to come in and do something nefarious. So that's typically where compliance comes into play. It's compliance to an industry standard pattern, and then compliance with a particular type of framework that may or may not be regulated to kind of drive revenue opportunities. And of course, the last piece there is you want to avoid like regulatory impact as well. Like if you have to be compliant with a certain framework to operate or provide a certain service or product, like you're going to get fined if you don't do it. So that's typically where frameworks like PCI, DSS, or payment card processing will come into play.
Got it. And let's take that down a level into like specific AI use cases or model. Let's talk about LLMs, for instance. For a lot of data being scraped, used for training, people are super worried, obviously, that their customer data or proprietary information is going to get pulled into like a soda model like GPT or something. How does security, compliance, trust, play in the using some of those kind of models?
Yeah. Trust is a very big factor in effectively implementing and governing, any AI use case. I will say that there are, you kind of segment this out into two areas of concern. The first one is elements of an AI system that could be governed effectively by existing security controls and governance frameworks. These are things like, where is the data that is being used to inform the model development? How is that data being stored? How is access control being governed? A lot of those questions are governed by standard security controls and frameworks that you would already be thinking about today. You'd want to think about, privileged access management, for example, like with access systems. That's already something you should be thinking about. Then there's this whole other separate area of concern that are introduced by the fact that AI is a novel and new technology that has new workflows and processing, and input and output, considerations that change how we think about risk. So that's really where a new full crop of risks have emerged. And subsequently, like I was saying before, a new crop of frameworks and forthcoming regulation is starting to crop up to effectively govern that risk.
Got it. So what kind of tools and solutions in this kind of compliance security ecosystem have you seen pop up? I know we chatted a little bit about a company called Vanta. Like, talk to us a little bit about the ecosystem around that. So if you're a product or engineering leader and you're being told we need to be compliant or we need to figure out our security posture for all of these AI solutions that are out there, like, where do you start?
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually lean into kind of the segmentation I described before, which is you have a kind of a whole ecosystem of GRC or governance, risk, and compliance tools that are really good at helping you essentially scour your internal infrastructure, connect to all sorts of different data points, and apply a governance framework on top of that. A set of controls that say, tell me about MFA, tell me about privileged access management, tell me about data retention, data deletion, all of these different controls that you would want to implement. And there's some level of increasingly automated compliance monitoring that comes through the form of like different health checkpoints and evaluations that help you to, in an automated fashion, understand the health of your system, the compliance health of your system against that framework, and also understanding gaps. Again, that is being squarely at kind of like common security controls. But the novel area that AI is introduced is interesting. So when we talk about AI and we talk about like governing responsible AI, we're talking about a few different kind of criteria that depend on kind of where in the AI stack or the workflow that you're thinking. So, you can have something like model governance. So, and models, of course, are the backbone of any AI system. They need to be trained, evaluated, and tested on a continuous basis to ensure conformity with whatever expectations that you set for the performance of that model. The ability to test and validate that performance does not exist with a lot of kind of traditional GRC tools. So you have a whole new crop of ecosystem tools that are formed specifically to evaluate model conformity and model verifiability, and to also demonstrate sort of the key tenets of responsible AI associated with that model, like explainability, reproducibility, et cetera. companies like Creo AI, Holistic AI, Cranium, these are all, fantastic upstarts in the space that are all doing really interesting work around governing AI processes and workflows. And they're helping you to hook into specific elements of your AI system and apply a lot of the AI specific governance and controls that you need to effectively demonstrate that you're building responsible and trustworthy AI.
Okay. Very interesting. Would you say, so talk a little bit more about what you guys are doing at
Sure.
Fabrik. In the middle of all that, kind of where do you see, the opportunities for you guys and how you help enterprises be compliant?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. At the end of the day, whether or not you're thinking about a more traditional element of your AI system or, any information security system, or if you're thinking about the AI specific element of what you're building, at the end of the day, like a big part of what you need to achieve as a security and compliance program is you need to demonstrate trust. You need to build trust with your customers, or else how are they going to decide to buy from you? And what I think a lot of folks are increasingly realizing is that because so much of the software supply chain is it's forming, we use SaaS for virtually every step of many workflows of any, virtually any work in our organization. So there's so much sprawl across the supply chain. There's so many vendors, more and more companies have hundreds and even thousands of vendors that they're using on an ongoing basis. And the key question is that from a buyer's perspective, from an enterprise risk perspective, there's a challenge around deciding, how do you trust your vendors? How do you decide how to trust your vendors? This is third-party risk management, kind of through and through. And these functions exist to assess their vendors for trust. And the kind of proxy for trust today comes in the form of a variety of compliance certifications, questionnaires, either standard frameworks or custom questions that you might want to ask to essentially vet your vendor's security and compliance posture and decide whether or not that's good enough for you to trust them.
Sure.
The challenge is for organizations that are building and deploying AI solutions, they have a bottleneck around effectively demonstrating that trust. It is hard today to respond to all of your customers' demands or third-party risk insight or third-party risk assessments. That comes in the form of security assessments, security questionnaires. Typically, these are like 100 or 200, questions long in an Excel spreadsheet or in a number of, dozens and dozens of different portals that you can go log into and manually enter data into as part of the assessment process. And at the end of the day, what we are really excited about at Fabrik is the opportunity to help companies to proactively demonstrate their security and compliance and trust posture and bridge that posture into the platforms that your customers might be using to assess your risk. What that means tactically is we work with companies who build, who use trust centers, which is essentially a form of document hosting and repository for publishing security artifacts. And we help you maximize the utility and ROI and impact of that investment by distributing that data to your customers, giving you insights into how that data is being used and helping you to close the loop around attribution of the impact of that data and that investment you're making to demonstrate trust across the your customer base.
Interesting. Sounds like a useful tool for revenue ops organizations that need to overcome the security objection.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, that's I think a big shift that's happening right now is the kind of mindset shift of security being a cost center that needs to be kind of optimized and kind of reduced to a value driver that could be amplified and finding ways to slot, security insurance, customer trust into those RevOps workflows essentially. And in kind of the world that we're imagining and we're seeing, grow is that you want to shift from just reacting to inbound requests for this kind of stuff. And you want to start anticipating what customers might need, where they want to consume it, and the specific questions that they're going to need to have answered to establish that trust.
Right. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you just some kind of fun questions here. Favorite AI tool, favorite AI model these days? Which one's most useful for you?
Yeah, there's some really cool stuff coming up from Claude. Sonnet, I think, was the model that just came out. That's got some really interesting applications, moving much more quickly, much more kind of like in a human tone, which has been pretty conversational. I've been a ChatGPT user for many, many months now. Since the enterprise edition came out, the team was loving the iteration there. The custom VPs have been really fun. But I think it's been also really cool to start playing with different SaaS applications that are starting to build more native infused capabilities, because that is kind of where the user specific context of how you want to interact with this for a magical moment come into play. It can help you to kind of augment workflows. So in the music world, producer, musician. I have a buddy who started a company called Lemonade, and they do ethically sourced and generated AI music content. So they do, think about, typically when you're producing music, you'll often go search for different samples and loops.
Sure.
Try to apply those to your context. And what they give you is a much more kind of curated in the workflow way of defining kind of what key you're working in, what vibe you're working on, what tempo, and they'll give you a lot of generated options directly to MIDI that can be played back in whatever MIDI context you're working in already. So some generic, hi-hat loop, it'll be in the hi-hats that you've defined per your samples.
Yeah.
Playing back the MIDI rhythm, for example. So really interesting. Yeah. Really interesting app doing some really interesting stuff built on ethically sourced data to try and develop those models. As part of their ethos.
Nice, man. Cool. Well, I appreciate you sharing your expertise around security. Definitely super interesting space, and hopefully a lot of people find what you're doing at Fabrik interesting. Maybe they can even integrate that with what we're doing here at Salad.
Appreciate that. Thanks so much, Jared, for having me on.
All right, brother. You have a good day.
Thank you.